But anyways, why don't we get started? It's
Sure.
been a little bit of a journey to get to this podcast, but thank you so much, Buddy Howard, for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Kevin. It's great to be on the podcast.
Yes. And before we get started, I always get people to share where people can find you just in case they have to run and do something halfway through the podcast.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. BuddyHoward.com. I've got a website there. I've also got my email address is buddy@buddyhoward.com or buddy@equityresearch.com, which was a company that I started a number of years ago. And they can find me there. My book, The Burden of Evidence, is available on Barnes and Noble, on Amazon. If you type in Buddy Howard, that's probably the easiest way to find it because there's not that many authors named Buddy Howard. And The Burden of Evidence is another way that you can get there.
Yeah, I debated whether to use my remember.
I debated whether to use my nickname or go with my full given name. And I thought, people know me as Buddy. I think I'm just going to stick with it. So if you type in Buddy Howard, you'll get to the book.
Well, fantastic. Well, why don't you let people know what you've written so far, if there's any future projects? I know people who might know you already from your book would like to hear that.
Great. Yeah. And thank you again so much, Kevin, for the opportunity to be on here. The Burden of Evidence is a legal thriller. The idea actually came to me about almost 50 years ago when I was at Wake Forest University, and I had a situation come up that I thought this would be a fascinating situation if this, from a legal standpoint, came up. I don't know if this has ever happened. And I can't really explain exactly what it is because it would give away a major spoiler of the book.
Yeah.
That doesn't really get revealed until pretty deep into the book. But I thought about that for a number of years, and I am in my late 60s, and when I was 25, I thought, one of my bucket list items is to write a book one day. I knew that I wanted to write a book. And so over the years, as I would go through life, I would see things that I thought, man, this scene belongs in a book somewhere, or this line belongs in a book. This is a beautiful piece of dialogue. And so I would collect. I had a place on my computer called Writing Thoughts, and I would just gather them. I would just collect them. And if anybody's thinking about writing a book one day, this is one of the big recommendations that I would make is find a file that you just throw stuff into. And then as you're going through your day, somebody will say something to you. If you don't write it down, it's lost. You'll never remember. What was that somebody said that was brilliant? And you'll think, man, I wish I'd written it down. If you have a file to put it, you'll collect it. So I went through most of my life thinking I was going to write this book, and really about 10 years ago started in earnest really writing this. It's a legal thriller called The Burden of Evidence. And what it's about a 55-year-old writer whose wife gets traumatized, and the wife doesn't want to go to the police. And so he takes matters into his own hands, and it backfires. And then he starts trying to extricate himself from this situation. And the more he tries, the less it works. And the more the stakes go up. And there's also a heavy element of a jury that this guy finds himself on. The main character whose wife was assaulted, he ends up being on a jury, and he knows some evidence that he cannot share with the rest of the jurors, and it affects his opinion of whether the person is guilty or not, the suspect is guilty or not, and he can't share it. And that's really where the title, The Burden of Evidence, came from. It's really a situation where there's a juror and they know evidence. And technically, from a legal standpoint, you can't consider anything that was not presented in the court. But in this case, he knows some information and he can't share it. And there's also a whodunit element, and that doesn't get revealed till the very final page of the book. And it was one of these books, Kevin, that as I wrote it, I sort of had a general idea of what the book was going to be. But as I wrote it, after a while, it started to really write itself. And there would be these twists that I didn't even see coming, where I would go, oh my gosh, that is a bombshell. That would be terrific from a standpoint of just pulling readers in and making them think, oh my gosh, what's going to happen now, and what will this main character do? And so it's really my first book of fiction. I have dabbled in nonfiction before, memoirs and things like that, but I have found over the years that fiction gives you such flexibility in terms of crafting a story. You can make the story whatever you want. And it's a lot less risky in a lot of ways than writing something like a memoir or something like that, where you may write something about someone else and they may be fine at the publication date getting it out there, but they may change their mind one day, and once it's out, you can't pull it back. Yeah. So things that are, nonfiction, that are particularly personal, I've always had a harder time getting comfortable sharing with the world. But something like this, I've really thoroughly enjoyed, and enjoyed getting the feedback from people that have read the book.
Yeah, I was actually really taken back when I read about the the mix between a very factual and detailed background of mergers and acquisitions, and it sounds like it gets into legal as well, and obviously because mergers and acquisitions is obviously a very legal subject, and then mixing into fiction, which is something I actually started to learn in college when I was studying as an accountant in English class. I was like, oh my goodness, I never considered the usefulness of this form of writing. And I found it, just for me personally, to be able to balance out all the details. So when you're writing, do you find that you're writing for yourself, or do you find that you're really wanting to convey something to an audience, like a situation?
A great question. I think there are elements of both. What I would tell you, when I referred earlier to doing some of the personal writing, we had a very difficult family situation with one of our kids in 2001. And I wrote about it. And I know when I wrote about it, Kevin, the biggest insights that I often had were when I was writing about it. And I would be writing and I would think, oh my gosh, I just realized, as I was thinking about this, trying to put it down, I just realized having a major understanding of what we needed to do to help our child at the time, and we did. My child did get things resolved, and in that case, I was in some ways really writing for myself, and I'd say that I ultimately, in some ways, I was writing for my daughter at the time, because one day what I wrote I gave to her, and she gave me kind of the one review that I wanted. It was kind of that letter that every dad kind of hopes to get one day from a child. That's basically what it was. And so in some ways I was really writing for her, but I was writing for my own understanding. It was a way of kind of like therapy in some ways for me too, to be putting that information down. And that's when I became a full-fledged believer in writing. Yeah. And in that process, that was when I kind of realized and concluded that everybody has a story. There's nobody that doesn't have a story. And every one of those stories is meaningful. Everyone has got, trials and tribulations, successes and failures and growth. Everybody's got one. It doesn't mean that everybody's got to publish a novel. It doesn't mean everybody's got to publish a book. But the idea of everybody having a story, I firmly believe, and every one of them is relevant and meaningful. So, that, going back to it's a long-winded answer to your question.
Oh, it's complete. That's what this format is for. You actually get We got to much more interesting stuff than the answers to the questions. So
sure, thank you. Yeah. Well, I write for myself in some cases. When it comes to the fiction and it comes to the burden of evidence, I really was writing more for other people and
cool.
trying to engage. And what has happened, what I've started to realize is, the payback for me on this book has nothing to do with the economics. It's got zero to do with the economics. It's got everything to do with relationships. So if I write something and somebody says, I read your book, really enjoyed it, and I wasn't sure what I would do if I was in Paul Nelm's case. I've thought about it, and I don't know. That engagement and the new relationship that's forged as a result of that, to me is absolutely priceless. And, I never will forget going to Barnes & Noble. And one of the right after it came out, I was in Barnes & Noble and they were selling it. And I was sitting there and I felt a little tug on my sleeve, and it was a little boy, 10 years old, and he said, "Can I have your autograph?"
Oh, and my goodness.
He was the cutest kid, and I was sort of going, "Yeah, can I have yours?" I was just so blindsided by that. And, it was one of those things where I just thought, I've achieved everything I really wanted out of this book already, because, to have an interaction like that, and those happen to me oftentimes. It's not necessarily a 10-year-old boy. It may be a man or a woman in my age who read the book and simply said they enjoyed it. I talked to a guy just the other night who lost his wife and he stopped reading. And this was the first book that he had picked up. And he was at a talk that I was giving. And we both almost teared up talking to one another about it, because he said, "I started reading your book, loved it, and I've started reading again after that." I never expected that to be one of the benefits of writing. And that's what it's turned out to be. So
it sounds like you have the perfect background for a book like that. It takes a certain change in pace from maybe just regular professional writers. Somebody who you'd think that isn't gonna be writing a thriller, a fictional thriller. When I describe enjoying fictional writing, and I'd say relatively fantasy compared to a business world, but a lot of people don't understand the benefits, or just haven't explored those benefits. And something that I stumbled upon the other day was somebody making the argument on a great sales pitch could actually use fictional writing. Because if you're trying to connect to somebody's story and tell them why you are useful as a company, what better way to do that than give them the story that they can connect to? Why rely on them having that perfect scenario to understand what it is that you're telling them? I'm just so I'm coming from that, and then we're having this conversation today, and I'm saying, what better conversation to be having today than this? And we'll get into the background. I mean, when did this career start? That it sounds like you had a very successful career.
Yeah, I'll tell you, there are a lot of lessons that I feel like I really want to share to the extent that they are useful for people. And one ties back to where you were just talking about with the being such a big difference between merger and acquisition work and writing a book. And the one thing I was going to say about that was that, I think that we limit ourselves oftentimes more than anyone else does. And I had to kind of give myself permission, number one, to allow myself to be able to see myself as a successful writer. And if I only allowed myself to see myself typecast in a merger and acquisition role, then, it would have been harder for me to invest the time to think that, well, maybe I can become a writer and maybe I can be decent at it. And the other thing that I had to get very comfortable with was making mistakes early on. The quicker you fail, the quicker you get to success.
Oh, I love that. That's the best piece of advice ever. Fail fast.
Because, it's kind of like the first time you tried this podcast, there were things, no doubt, that did not work. And yet it was only through that you became so good at it. So, all the hiccups and things that don't happen, that people don't see, I'm betting the way you got there was, you did it the same way I did when I wrote the book. You made some mistakes. You regrouped, you stood back up, and you kept going. And that's what I think people have to do. And so anyway, I'm glad you feel the same way, because to me, that idea of, fear of failure keeping you from ever moving, it paralyzes people. And if they just get comfortable with it and move through it, that's really the best way to get to success.
Yeah, I feel like I never had that. I think wanting to go into business my whole life, and I feel like I haven't had it as much, but trying to understand that that's normal, and it's actually a good thing to go, do a sprint and get to the idea that finally works. It's so important. Oh my goodness. And then when I learned about that, I doubled down on that, and I just got so good at starting something, and then there's going to be 30 problems and things that don't work, and then find the thing that does, and then you go with it right there.
That is spot on.
That is just such an exciting feeling for anybody who does not do that and tries to pre-plan. Definitely get addicted to that process, because you can plan, but you got to find that thing that's, that's got a little bit of momentum, which is a word that I've been loving lately.
Yes.
But yeah, so I mean, talking about your background, just because I think it's such a perfect contrast of your writing. So you go to school for what in the past?
Yeah, went to Wake Forest undergraduate, majored in business, and then got my MBA from South Carolina, and then started working in kind of a strategic planning, some merger and acquisition work, and worked there at that company for 5 years, and then moved to a brokerage firm. So this was in 1986. And worked there for 3 years from 86 to 89. And I was a research analyst. So I was an equity analyst. I would write about companies that were publicly traded and say, hey, this stock is a good investment for these reasons. That sounds like
so much fun.
It was fun.
In those years.
That was great.
Oh my goodness. That's like the peak time of not being enough technology to where, oh my goodness, I'm so jealous.
It was fun. It was a lot of fun. But here's what happened that was interesting. And this was another one of these lessons for me. The company that I worked with was acquired, and they shut down the research department. So I basically lost my job in 1989. And so my wife and I had one child at home, had one on the way. My job options were New York City. We live in Raleigh, North Carolina. And so my job options were either in Nashville, Tennessee, or New York City. We were pretty locked into the Raleigh-Durham area of North Carolina and really didn't want to move. And so I started thinking, I wonder if I could start something on my own. And so I just sort of gradually started reaching out to people that I knew and said, look, I'm thinking about doing this. And it was kind of like a contract investor relations or public relations, but with an investment focus to it, and started reaching out to people and trying to build a business around that. And I started it as under the name Equity Research Services. And that was in December of 89. I've still got it today. And so it's not a huge company in terms of employees, but it has provided my, my career a lot of consistency and longevity and consistency of income. And it's grown.
Which is important in that industry because it is tough.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And the thing that I did that I think if I were talking to somebody who, let's say, lost their job today, the first thing that I would say is that as I look back, and it's been 35 years now that happened. As I look back career wise, best thing that ever happened to me was losing my job. Best thing at all that ever happened was me losing my job. I'm not saying that there wasn't a lot of anxiety to that. I'm not saying that there weren't risks. I'm not saying it always works out the way it did with me. But I had to get beyond that crisis period to understand that if I was consistent with effort, that if I kind of going back to your comments about the failure and the sensitivity to timing and moving quickly and doing things without wasting a lot of time worrying you're going to fail. I mean, I had to go out and basically make cold calls, to see if I could get people.
And that is a tough industry to start your own business in. That might be one of the, other than putting rockets up in space, I'm pretty sure that's right at the top.
Yeah, I had to get very comfortable that, hey, if somebody says they're not interested, not taking it personally. But I also had to make sure I had something that was a pretty reasonable thing to pitch. And the other thing I tried to do is, as I talked to them, find out what their needs were, what their pain point was. And if I sensed anything about, what I'm really struggling with, you're talking to me about this, but what I'm really struggling with is this, I try to think, is there any way I can pivot so that I can address whatever that issue is, and always having that ear open for what that is. If you're talking to somebody and they're telling you what their issue is, coming up with a solution to that is a real fundamental thing. And I sometimes would have that happen. Somebody would say, we don't need that, but what we need somebody to help us write our annual report to shareholders. I thought, well, I've done that before, so, hey, would you ever be interested in letting me just take a look and maybe I could help you do that. So, I think that as I look back, the starting my own business really gave me a lot of flexibility to be able to write the book and work on the book when I decided that I wanted to. It also created a lot of flexibility so that when my child got sick, which is what I was talking about earlier in the call, I was able to stop my job, move to alternate going to Baltimore, Maryland for a month at a time, and kind of take turns with my wife, alternating being up there when she was 11 years old. So, things like that gave me a great deal of flexibility that I'm not sure I would have had I been working for a demanding boss that said, look, I know I'm sorry about what you're dealing with, but you need to report to work on Monday through Friday.
Wow, so, I'm just so surprised that you say you built your own company without being, a top firm. I mean, just in accounting, there's basically the big four firms. It's just a perfect example of, welcome to our world. Good luck. Yeah. You're not gonna build another firm. And there are consultants. Oh my goodness. Is that ever a world that's difficult? I just want to stress that to anybody listening and say that is a major thing to consider when reading this book and understanding the amount of structure. There's flexibility, but wow, is that world ever structured? And if writing fiction can be useful here, then basically anybody can take that seriously. The thing that is awesome. That's an important lesson for parents and the way they deal with it with their children, I believe, because I know that a lot of parents and anybody, when in a general conversation, is quick to say, they're in their own world. They're talking about this, they're talking about that, and you can get a lot of lessons out of that. And you can also convey, and there's a lot of value for the business world, as I said, in that.
That's absolutely true. And we were talking about everybody's got a story and everyone's meaningful. I sit there and I think about the intergenerational communications that occur. And you mentioned parent, child, communication. I think about also grandparent, child.
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
I spoke to a man the other day, and he was working on kind of, this is my takeaway to my grandkids. And this is, it doesn't have to be a book. It can be, look, if I'm giving you my life lessons, here's a 3-page summary, very personal to you, Bobby or Susan, whatever the grandchild's name is. This is my letter to you. And the thing I love about that is that granddad, if it's a granddad that's writing, or a grandmother if she's writing it, one day will not be here. And that grandchild will be sitting there thinking back on that grandparent. And the grandparent's voice will still be there through that written word. The writing ends up allowing your voice to be there beyond the time that you are. And so the notion that it's something that gives comfort, when someone has lost a loved one, I think is very relevant, but also the instructional and wisdom element of it, I think is important as well. And, it just becomes such a meaningful thing. I lost my dad very unexpectedly when he was 59, and I was 22. And so he, like that, went heart attack, and so he was just gone. So I never had really an opportunity to have that kind of, takeaway, if you were leaving Dad, what would you tell me, or whatever. And so, I think it's kind of one of those situations, everybody could almost write something and have it be available just in case, God forbid, but something bad happens, that you got a message that you would want to leave with a loved one. Mm-hmm. So it's that intergenerational comment you made a minute ago just made me think about that, and how meaningful that makes writing oftentimes.
Mm-hmm. So you went from corporate world to your own business, and then have always stayed there?
Yeah, the one change to that was in 2005. I was doing this business writing. It was kind of again, kind of like investor relations work for companies that were publicly traded. And in 2005, I met with a guy, and he said, I've got a merger and acquisition background. Would you want to work together? And I was just super impressed with this guy. This guy's an engineer, electrical engineer by training, but had started doing some M&A work. And this guy just blew me away in terms of his integrity, in terms of his professionalism, his technical expertise, just brilliant. And I thought, absolutely. So we started working together in 2005. The firm's called High Rock Partners, and we started working together back then, and really built the firm up for the next 20 years. I still do some work. I've kind of scaled back the time that I spend doing that, but my business partner and I still talk frequently and still have some projects that we're working on together, but it's a little more of a tempered pace from what it was in the past. But that's the only other major departure from me just kind of building this investor relations service on. And I've had employees over time that have kind of come and gone. I've got one woman who's been with me for decades, and it's just terrific.
Wow.
But yeah,
congratulations. It's
thank you.
To do.
Yeah.
And so we're talking about impressive career, and career more like entrepreneur. This is huge. This is 2 successful companies, and you were there to start them both. And so, that's almost makes a better example than I was going to make before about talking about structure. You cannot, there's almost, it's to some people, I was just thinking about this. To some people, being an entrepreneur is almost more relaxed. It's actually more demanding, in my opinion.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
So if you were to say somebody is like when you think about writer, you think about somebody who's traveling around and experiencing who knows what and running around and chasing stories and being quite free-minded. Not to say that you're not free-minded, but sitting at the boardroom and writing was something that stood out to me. That was interesting. And that's what led to my question about, do you write for yourself or your writers? But that shows the real world experience tying in with the writing.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think it's one of those situations where we tend to typecast, or at least I'll speak for myself. I tended to typecast myself. I thought, I'm a financial analyst. I'm a finance guy. I'm an investment guy. That's who I am, And that ends up being so limiting. And I didn't realize that I was decent at sales. I just never had a chance to try it out. But when I started my own firm, guess what? That's what it is. I mean, you've got to get out and hustle. And you've got to watch, you got to read body language, you've got to look somebody right in the eye and say, sometimes I'd go in and I would try different approaches. I'd say, look, this may not be a fit for you, and if so, I'll cut out quick. That was almost, in a way, some of the better pitches that I made, because that was just better than me saying, hey, I really think you need to buy this, or I really think you need to hire me to do this. That automatically put people sort of on the defense. But when I went in sometimes and said, look, this may not make sense for you, but let me just run it by you. And then the other thing that I did is sometimes I'd say, have you got any suggestions just how I would improve my pitch? And somebody, I was trying to raise money for a nonprofit one time, and somebody told me this. I just love this quote. They said, look, if you're trying to raise money, ask for advice. If you're trying to get advice, ask for money. And that is so true. And I'll tell you, it's kind of like,
so true.
Because it's sort of like, if you ask for money, they're going to say, yeah, I can't do this, but, I'll tell you who you ought to call. You ought to call so-and-so. That's free advice. But if you go to somebody and you say, hey, I'm thinking about, we're trying to raise, $100,000 for this technology campaign for this particular organization. I'm thinking about this. I'm trying to rationalize how to approach this. I'm thinking about going here, maybe going here. You got any ideas? All of a sudden, they're engaged. They're part of the solution. And here's what happens, I believe. When you come to me, Kevin, you ask me that question and I start responding, I got skin in the game. I've got advice that I'm giving you. That's a great
line to put in there. Yeah.
Yeah. And so all of a sudden, I'm thinking about, hey, I've told him, I hope this works. And so I'm already kind of pulled in a little bit to that process. And so learning things like that were things that I didn't realize until I started pitching, that new business. And I had never allowed myself the chance to think that I might be decent at something like that. And I had to kind of be open to the idea that, hey, even if I'm not good at it, I can develop that skill. And I think I got better at two things I really got better at after I started my business. I'm not saying I was great at it right away, but I think I got pretty good at it. Was one, reading people pretty quickly. I tend to trust people really quickly. I mean, the way you relate is the way that I kind of like to have people relate to me. And the other thing I think I got good at was making fast decisions. It ties back with your earlier comment about, you got a fixed amount of time. And if you think about time, it's like the one unrenewable resource that we've got. We've got, no more than a certain number of years on Earth. So, time is precious. And so that's the other thing that I think I got better at.
Yeah, talking about time, I heard it took 8 years to write the novel.
Yeah, it did. And it's interesting the way it finally kind of came to a conclusion. So I've been working on it for 8 years, and my wife and I in February of 2025 were having dinner with some people, and I was working on the novel and I was talking about it, and the wife, Susan, said, "Well, you know what you need? You need a deadline." And I said, "Oh, it's probably right." She said, "Yours is July 4th of this year. That's your deadline." So this is February. So that meant 4 months. And I thought, well, okay. So every time I saw her in the future, she would say, "How's it coming? Because, you've got 3.5 months now. How is it going? You've only got 3 months now, 2.5 months now." So that kind of kept, that having a specific date that somebody had put in on the calendar, and then having a accountability partner that was saying, "How are you coming? Because, July 4th is coming up." I ended up uploading to Amazon on July 3rd. It worked. It worked.
Nice.
For me, having a person that kind of said, "Look, this is the deadline." And the other thing that I had to work hard on was not letting perfect be the enemy of good. And what I mean by that is, I felt 9.5 months pregnant with this book when it finally came out. And, I had worked on it, edited it. I had a bunch of editors that I used. I had a bunch of beta readers that I had read it.
Oh, cool.
And, when you're writing a book like this, you can edit it forever and never be totally 100% satisfied with it. But I think I had to finally say, you know what, you're at a point that you've got to get this book out. And I'm so pleased with it. I've gotten real good reviews on Amazon. I've got, I think, 97 reviews, and my average review is like 4.6, I think.
Oh, nice. Congratulations.
So, thank you. Yeah, I feel really good about it, and it really reflects, it doesn't just reflect me by any means. It reflects a lot of editors and others who helped me on this book.
Yeah, that must have been so exciting to get your first star on Amazon when you saw it come through. Because this is your first book.
Yeah.
Wow. And writing it for so long and then setting a deadline. What are some of the challenges that you faced when you were writing it, or did it come natural to you?
The hard part was doing things like having a certain storyline, and then you might make a change. And then everything, let's say you've written a draft. So let's say you've gotten through an entire draft, and now you're in the rewrite. You let a beta reader read it, and they say, well, this drug a little bit here. You need to change this. And so you're going back and you're rewriting things. And sometimes you'll change something that changes throughout the whole story. I'll give you an example. Main character, Paul Nelms, in one of the earlier versions, he had a character trait that made it even more difficult for him than it was. And so I let a beta reader read it. I'll just go ahead and say what it was. He was drinking a little more than he should have been drinking in one of the earlier versions. And he was drinking partly to a kind of self-medicate from the stress that he was going through. And I was kind of using that to demonstrate the level of his mental anguish and mental pain and everything else. But one of the beta readers said, I lost some respect for him when I read that. And I thought, that's all I need to hear. I'm pulling it. I'm pulling that out. So I had to go back through the entire book, and any reference to, him pouring himself a drink of scotch or whatever it was, I pulled it. But what that meant, I had to go through that entire book.
Yeah.
And make sure I pulled every reference and things like that. But at the end of the day, I really wanted characters that people loved. And when she said I lost some respect for Paul, I thought, man, that's all I needed to hear.
That's a great comment and a great reaction, but that must have been a lot of work.
It was a lot of work. It was a lot of work. And I did one other thing that you might find interesting. I didn't use AI at all to write the book. And I
don't even think they had. When did they start with ChatGPT? I don't think it was around 8 years ago, or at least.
No, that's exactly right. But what I did do that really was fun was I used AI to come up with what a rendering of these characters looks like.
Oh,
and so
cool.
I've got on YouTube, if somebody wants to see what these characters look like, they can go to YouTube, type in Buddy Howard, The Burden of Evidence, and they'll see the cast of characters, the cast.
That's actually such a good idea. That's a really great use for that.
Yeah. And it's fascinating. And, when I was doing this, it would give me a rendering and I'd say, Catherine, that shot of Catherine, she looks 35 years old. She's 50. You need to make her look older. So I did go back and forth, with AI when it was doing these, but I loved where we landed on that video, where I landed on that video.
That is a fantastic and healthy way to use AI as a writer, to be able to know what your book looks like to that. And then, is that what I wanted to say? And wow, what a fantastic tip. I'm going to be using that, and I can guarantee other writers are going to be doing that.
Yeah, please do, because it's really fun, and I think it's been meaningful for some of my prospective readers who have thought about it, but it's also been really good for the people who've read the book, and most of them say, "Oh yeah, that's Tony. I knew that was Tony."
That is going to be used in education. Like, when you're trying to teach a kid how to write, what are you trying to do? You're trying to make sure the other person understands what they're trying to say.
Yeah.
Give them that image of what they're trying to say. They see, oh, I was not trying to say that. I've got to write this better. That's a very motivating tool as well. Wow.
Yeah, it was so much fun. And the other thing I would just say relating to that is, and I say this in the video on the YouTube, I make this point. So if somebody watches, they'll have to hear it twice. But, I've come to really like these characters. And I say in the video, it's kind of sad when I think about the fact they're not real. And so that's the other thing is when I talk about Paul, when I talk about Catherine, Daniel, Tom, all these characters, I've now got a specific facial image that I have when I think about them. And the other kind of cool thing is there are a lot of readers out there who have the exact same image right now too.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that is the first time I heard that, and I think that writing tip is just going to completely change some writer's life out there if they're listening to that.
Great,
because that's just absolutely like that would be. I mean, I almost want to get writing just right after you said that, but I'm going to keep that for after.
I love it. Well, good.
Oh my goodness,
that's great.
Sometimes I hear things that are just such a good idea. It's like halfway through a lecture, and then I would just leave the lecture. I'm like, boom, and go and get started working. And that's why I took a pause from school for a little bit to get going on some other projects.
Good for you. I think that's admirable. Yeah.
Yeah. The self-publishing. You decided to go with self-publishing, and I know nothing about the publishing process. What were some of the decisions that you had to make with a piece of work that you've been dealing with for 8 years?
Yeah, I did toy with the idea of using a traditional publisher, and I may go to a traditional publisher with the next one. I really don't know. The thing that I really did like about self-publishing was retaining full control over the cover, over the content, over the pricing, over the timing of the release. All of those things, if you sell your book to a traditional publisher, they'll consider your wishes in those things, but technically they own the book. And so they really have the final authority on a lot of those issues. And, that July 4th deadline, for example, that I was working with, I was committed to doing that. I was committing to hitting that deadline. If I had a publisher that I had sold the book to and I was relying on their schedule, and maybe they've got 5 other books that are coming out in the prior 3 weeks, they may have said, look, we can get you out, but it's going to be not until, August or September. And so I really wanted to have the control that I would have as a self-publisher. I also like learning. And when you are self-publishing, there are a ton of decisions that you have to make. For example, what's the font that you're going to use? Well, in my business writing, I always use Times New Roman. Well, in fiction, Garamond is one of the most common fonts that people use. I didn't know that, but I had to learn it. I
didn't know that either.
Yeah, I had to learn what is the font size that makes sense. I also had to think about paper size. So this book is 5.5 inches this way, 8.5 this way, and making a decision like that, I didn't know how to even go about it. So I went to Barnes and Noble with a tape measure and started measuring all of the books. That's a great way to do it. Measuring all the books in my genre. And so, making decisions like that and thinking through how do you make that decision. And in fact, one thing I would say is, if you have people that are listening to this and they want to reach out to me, feel free, and I can, tell you some of the things that I learned in the process. But, there are tricks or things that you want to consider. I have a hardback as well as a paperback. And if you have a hardback that is larger than your paperback, generally speaking, that's going to change the page count. So in my mind, I thought, if I've got a book club, and I love doing book clubs. If anybody hears this and they like book clubs, I can do a Zoom book club and be at the book club and talk about the book. And I love doing that, by the way. But if I have a book club and one person has the hardback and one person has the paperback, if the paperback and the hardback are on different page sizes, they're not going to be on the same page. If somebody says, hey, I look at page 135, when he says this, the other person's not going to have the same writing on page 135. By having them both be 8.5 by 5.5, they're always going to be aligned. You can have the hardback, you have the paperback, they're going to be on the same page.
It's actually pretty interesting, all the details that go behind the publishing process. It sounds like, oh my goodness, so many details.
So many. Yeah, there's so many. It
sounds a little exciting though, being able to learn about all that.
Yeah, there's exciting because in many cases there's at least for me, a right answer. And, there are better answers but in my case, there was like an optimal solution in a lot of cases, but it was just thinking through it enough to kind of get there.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, I was reading some of the lines that I was trying to confuse myself, find something that didn't make any sense at all. And conscience meets consequence. That didn't make any sense to me. So I know that there's something there for me to learn. What does that mean?
Conscience meeting consequence. And that's a really good one. When I opened up the talk this morning, I talked a little bit about how the main character is on a jury, and he knows some evidence that can't be disclosed. If he discloses it, there's a very big consequence for him personally. Mm-hmm. His life essentially is over. As he knows it. His life is over if he discloses this to the jury. But there's a conscience element in that if he doesn't disclose it, the suspect may be found guilty and he may have to live with that. So that would be on his conscience. So does he end up winding up taking a chance by disclosing that evidence that he knows, knowing that that might put at risk everything that he's come to love? And that's where this book is heading. Wow. You want to know that at the beginning of the book, and it kind of evolves. And I'm giving away absolutely as much as I really should for someone who's reading the book, because even giving that away will give them more than I really like to give them.
Yeah, how tough is it to explain what a book is about without spoiling the whole book? I was thinking about that the other day. I'm like, I almost feel bad sometimes asking any questions about books or anything to do with authors, because how are you guys supposed to say that? So I try to talk about you guys, and because that gets me excited to read the book. But how do you explain something without explaining it? Because that's what I'm trying to read. Later.
Yeah, and I think you have to decide what parts you're just not going to bring up. There are a couple of things I'm not going to even allude to because they are, one of my beta readers was reading the book, and he would put comments to the side and give it back. And I looked at his comments one time, and to the side of one of these things, he said, bombshell, exclamation point. And I loved that because he didn't see it coming at all. And to me, that's the payback for a writer when they get those comments like that. And so, there are certain things in that book I'm just not even going to allude to, but you try to at least communicate something about the characters. And one other thing that I do when you're asking, how do you respond? I will put in there things like there's symbolism in this book, and so I'll talk about that. There's, for example, the setting in this book is Detroit, and Detroit in 2013 declared bankruptcy. It was the largest city to ever declare bankruptcy, and so
it's just crazy for a city to declare bankruptcy.
It is. So 2017 to 2019, which is the time stamp of what this novel when it takes place. During that time period, Detroit was recovering, and in the same way, my main character Paul is kind of recovering. He's kind of changing himself. He's kind of getting stronger and growing himself. And so in some ways, Detroit was symbolic of the main character, Paul. And so there's symbolism there. There's also a heavy musical element of symbolism in this book. At one of the opening scenes, the main character, Paul, wakes up and hears his wife, Catherine, playing Moonlight Sonata on the piano. And at the very end of the book, there's a scene where Moonlight Sonata is being played on a piano, a player piano. And that music, Moonlight Sonata, is really symbolic of how Paul feels about his wife. And it really represents Paul's love for Catherine. And that kind of changes as this story progresses. There are things that happen that kind of affect that. But when he hears it at the end of the book, he has a reaction, and it shows you where he is in that journey with his wife. And so, I love putting things like that into a book. A lot of people won't pick up on it, but if I mention that to them and they're reading the book and then they hear Moonlight Sonata, or they imagine it being played in the book, they have an appreciation for it. So sometimes
that is such a good point to be making, that you can talk about the things that most people are not going to catch, but that enhances the read.
Yeah.
And that, I didn't tie two and two together. That's actually why I really like I started to fall in love with the idea of book clubs. And it made me really happy I started a podcast, because in some ways it feels like a book club, to where you can talk about it. And just the amount you can talk about with a book is just fantastic. That gives a great idea for people to talk about, and for new authors who are trying to figure out, what do you talk about? For some people, they think they just have to do some media circuit and then they're done, but it's really an opportunity to point out the little tiny bits and details, and it probably never stops.
It doesn't. It doesn't. I'll give you one other example of that. I was talking in a group a couple of nights ago, and I was making this point. Whenever I've read a book, a piece of fiction, I always really prefer to have a single point of view. And I really worked hard to maintain a single point of view from Paul, main character's his point of view. So if I was talking about what Daniel was thinking or what was going through his mind, it was most often in the context of Paul looking at Daniel's expression and reading that expression, and him thinking, Paul figured that Daniel must be frustrated based on, it was something like that, or quizzical look in Daniel's eyes or something like that. And so it's one of those things that 99.9% of the people that would read this book would never stop and say, wow, he really never left Paul's head. He stayed, this is a third person point of view. It's not, a first person. Paul is not talking. I'm talking about Paul, but the whole time it's looked at through Paul's eyes. And so I really maintain kind of that whole perspective and never really lose track of that. That's an example of something that a reader wouldn't know unless I mentioned it to them.
Yeah, wow. The big and the small points are the ones that aren't obvious, but the words that you're reading, like really the stuff you could cite, I guess. When you have to write a bit of a paper on it, that might be the stuff for writers to talk about. Well, because that's interesting, because you have more of an audience than just the readers. It's also writers who learn from that as well.
Yes.
And think of, what better way to think of that than in school? We study pieces of writing all the time. And what are we doing? Exactly what's happening on a podcast, now that I think of it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
Wow. Well, buddy Howard, that was a very interesting conversation. And maybe why don't we end off and wrap back a little bit at somebody who's hasn't thought about writing before, might be thinking about it, might be in a career where it doesn't make any sense, might be a retirement plan. I've heard that one. What is something that you would tell them?
First of all, do it. And, if you don't know what to write, it kind of goes back to what you said earlier, Kevin. Just start, just start. And when I first started writing this book, I started this storyline. I started a separate novel and started a third novel. And I was kind of working on 3 at the same time.
Oh, cool.
And then this one ended up taking off. And then well into this one, I ended up...
Let me cut you off, because that's really interesting. By taking off, what do you mean? Like, were you testing for writers with these beta writers early on?
It was just which one internally I felt like I was pulled to push. And so I had one that was a kid that was in Guatemala, a young kid who was getting ready to be adopted, and he'd be leaving Guatemala. I had another one that was a gang member And that was based on, was sort of started after I heard a interview on NPR, and the guy was interviewed, and I ended up starting to write a novel about him. And then The Burden of Evidence, I started writing. So what happened in that case was I was working on all three, developed the gang member story a pretty good bit, and then started working on Burden of Evidence. And it took off. And when I say took off, I just mean I started working on it exclusively. But what was interesting is I got to a place in the Burden of Evidence where I needed a gang member. And
that's a fantastic time. Yeah, I love when that happens.
I took what I had written and I dropped it in to the Burden of Evidence. And so that is the character. And so there's a section where he's telling his story. Toward the end of the Burden of Evidence, there's a section where he's kind of telling the story, or actually Paul is kind of telling his story for him. And that came about because I was writing 3 different novels, and then I merged that second one into the Burden of Evidence.
That's a great example why you just got to get writing, producing your own works.
Yeah.
Because you never know when you might be at work and you might be needing a story, and hey, you actually wrote something and you have full ownership over that. You can use it. It's actually funny. The introduction to this podcast uses a song that I made a long time ago that doesn't have any copyright or anything. I just went back into old files. Luckily, I even found it, and I just dropped it in, and it was already done, and it was probably
great.
Me forever. I
love it.
That is a fantastic feeling. But anyways, I want to thank you one more time for coming on and talking to us. Why don't you let people know where they can find you online again, and then they can continue chatting with you?
That's right. Just go to www.buddyhoward.com. You can email me at buddy@equityresearch or buddy@buddyhoward.com. And then the book is available on, Amazon. There's an audio book. Audible has got it. In fact, Audible's got a great price on it right now. If somebody uses Audible, you can get a really cheap version of it. I don't know how.
Audible also has free trials sometimes as well. And then there's all sorts of deals there they're pretty awesome to
That's
use.
exactly right. And you can always order it through, if Barnes & Noble or any bookstore should be able to get it, because it's available through Ingram Spark, which is a distributor that distributes to all bookstores. So any bookstore you go into should be able to get it for you. So it should be really easy to get. If you just remember Buddy Howard, The Burden of Evidence, you'll be able to find it.
Oh, awesome. Well, thank you so much for chatting with us. I'm going to be thinking about this conversation. I know that the topics have been coming up in mind, especially the one about writing. It's something that I've actually just been meaning to write about that, because it's something I don't hear. You don't hear, business 101, learn to write fiction. It's how you sell people, and it's also how you keep interested in the world of numbers. So thank you so much again for coming on and writing, and can't wait to hear from you on some future work.
That sounds great. Thank you, Kevin.